of you who are here at City Hall every day, and I've told him I'm going to be equally candid here with you and with him, and I respect the fact that he's here. I respect the fact that he's here standing next to me, and he will of course say a few words after I'm finished. But we really were discussing today the provincial budget and Toronto's needs as regard that particular budget. Over the last few months, there's been a lot said and written about the relationship between the province of Ontario and the City of Toronto. And while I continue to work professionally with the Premier and with this minister and other ministers in the Government of Ontario, there is no question but that our relationship was significantly impacted when the Ontario Government refused to grant the City the request that it had made to have greater control of its own finances by being able to place tolls on the Don Valley Parkway and the Gardiner Expressway. It hasn't been business as usual. And I would say to you that the relationship won't get back to business as usual until we can find ourselves in a position to satisfy the needs of the 3 million people, nearly 3 million people, that call Toronto home. Those who rely on our city from across the region as well, and I think people across Canada who rely on this city to be healthy and dynamic and vibrant. Today, in my meeting with the Minister, I stressed that his upcoming budget has to help Toronto, that it is Ontario's largest city, it's Ontario's economic powerhouse, and it's Canada's global champion. And it needs investment right now. We need a better deal with the province when it comes to transit, when it comes to housing, and when it comes to the regional highways that we fund entirely, and when it comes to the economic potential of the city's waterfront. These funding needs are no secret. But it gave me an opportunity today in kind of in an organized way to convey those needs to the Minister and to talk about the things that are going to be necessary to move the city forward. And I've also made it clear on a number of occasions, and I will again now, that I'm going to do what I have to do in advance of an election that is forthcoming in Ontario, and that is to sit down with the leaders of all of the provincial political parties and canvass them for their ideas and their commitments to the future well-being of the City of Toronto, because that's my job. So what do we need? Well, on transit, the Minister and I discussed the fact that we have a need of a partnership with both the federal government and the provincial government, partnering with the city on some of our major future transit projects. We're expecting to receive additional funding allocations from the Federal Transit Infrastructure Fund in the coming days. And we need provincial funding to match the federal funding and our own contribution if we're going to get done projects like the Relief Line, the Eglinton East LRT, and Waterfront Transit. We need the funding from the other governments to make these projects happen. They are on the priority list we have been asked to and have in fact submitted to the federal government, and we talk quite a bit about those projects and what they entail. And this is no different than the past when projects of this magnitude were partnerships. These new lines will connect drastically underserved areas in our city and in our region and ease the pressure on the existing transit system. They will make up for decades of underinvestment, and they will also benefit the entire region. Without the Relief Line, we cannot pretend that an extension northward of the Yonge Street subway is in the cards. I have previously indicated that I will not support such a northward extension of our Yonge Street subway without a funded relief project in hand. It would be irresponsible to do otherwise. And I know a number of the Minister's colleagues at Queen's Park are very interested in seeing that project, the Yonge Street one, move ahead, but we have to have the Relief Line first. Without the Eglinton East LRT, we cannot truly serve the people of Scarborough or connect our city to our important neighbours in the Durham region. They're part of, again, serving the entire region and serving for the first time properly Scarborough. Without waterfront transit, we really can't unlock the full potential of one of the largest pieces of undeveloped real estate anywhere in North America. It represents a huge potential for jobs and development, and the Minister and I certainly agreed on that, a very promising potential. But it's going to need transit service in the form of the waterfront LRT, which is on our priority list. On housing, we're asking the province, no surprise here, to fund its share, namely $864 million or thereabouts, its share of the multi-billion-dollar repair backlog that we've seen in existence for some time now. The city has already stepped up to fund its share. We have invested, at the end of this year, we will have invested $1 billion, $250 million in this year's budget at repairing those housing units. The housing was dropped on the city's doorstep after years of neglect by other levels of government with no plan and no money to keep those housing units in a state of good repair. And without real action by the other levels of government, we're going to be in a position where, having exhausted the ability to put up more money on our own, we would have to look at closing some of those units. So let me be very clear. Any closure of such units would be a direct result of the inaction of the other governments to partner with us in carrying out those repairs, and projects of that magnitude were never intended to be carried out by property taxes alone. The pressures of today are too acute for me as Mayor of Toronto to let housing be forgotten and shortchanged once again. I'm deeply concerned about housing prices, and the Minister and I discussed that today, and that's housing prices in Toronto for both renters and buyers. Because, like many people, I'm uncertain as to what effective, responsible steps we could or should take to address soaring prices, I informed the Minister today of two things that I am going to do. The first is to ask our City Manager, Peter Wallace, to report to me by the end of the month on the latest thinking of the Federal, Provincial, City Working Group that has been established in cooperation with the Government of Ontario and with the Federal Government, looking at housing prices in Toronto over these last few months. Secondly, I will convene immediately upon my return from India a meeting involving some of the best available housing and planning experts and financial experts to seek their advice on the cause of skyrocketing prices and what they think we should do about it. I think, as you will all know, there hasn't been any kind of unanimity on the answer as to what we might do, so we can get together. But one thing I have said we can do, and this is a point I made with the Minister today, is we can work harder at increasing housing supply, especially affordable rental and ownership housing options. The province owns surplus land, for example, in the West Don lands, and it could be used right now to help us create new neighbourhoods in this city, consisting largely of affordable housing and adding to our affordable housing supply. The city has already done this, as you know, put up a number of pieces of property, and the shovels are in the ground in multiple cases. With the stroke of a pen, Minister Sousa and his colleagues could give thousands of families a chance to live a more affordable life right here in Toronto if we could get on with some of those projects on current provincial, I'll call it surplus land. I also repeated the need for the province to step up and help fund the Gardiner Expressway rehabilitation. This is a regional road. About 40% of the people who use it are from other than the 416. They're from outside the City of Toronto, and yet we're left to pay for it on our own. And I think that in this case that we would expect that there could be some assistance given to us with the care and upkeep of that roadway, or the Government of Ontario could indicate to the people, including in 905, why it is of no priority for them. We finally discussed the Portlands, and I mentioned this earlier on, and the need to get on with the flood protection work. The flood protection work is a precursor, a prerequisite to any of the development taking place, and it is time for us all to move forward as a three-partner $1.25 billion project that we can undertake together. The land is lying dormant at the heart of a vibrant and growing city and represents an exciting prospect for city building. Now, I understand that there's only one taxpayer and that the Minister has been challenged in balancing his budget and also balancing the needs of all areas of the province. But I also know that the province has money to fund a lot of its priorities because of the success of Toronto. I'm not trying to anger anybody else in any other part of the province by saying this, but Toronto's success, Toronto's contribution to the well-being of this province, including its financial well-being, cannot be underestimated. Our success, we are the economic and the financial engine of this province, and to ignore the city's needs in areas like housing and transit, in my view, puts the city's economic performance and thus our financial performance at risk. So I'm optimistic that the federal budget coming up next week is going to provide a measure of additional investment in transit and in housing. And the question will then become what happens after that, what the details of that are, but also what happens after that vis-a-vis our friends at the Government of Ontario, and whether they will choose to partner with us and with the Government of Canada to move transit and housing forward. In my view, it would be a grave mistake for the Government of Ontario to choose not to step up on housing and transit in particular, which are vital to the future well-being of this province. But I'm optimistic that they will make the right choice. I'd now like to turn the podium over to Charles Sousa, who I will say has been someone who's always been willing to take our calls, to convene meetings like this, and to discuss the future well-being of this region, of which he's very much a part in many respects, even though a minister for the entire province. And I'm very pleased again that he came here to see us today. And I did explain to him that the comments I made are substantive in nature vis-a-vis the relationship between the two governments, and not in any way indicative of what has been a good relationship we have had, he and I, over the many years, but including in the time that I've been mayor. Minister?
Well, thanks for that introduction, John. The mayor has done an excellent job in expressing the concerns and demands of the city, a growing city, a city that represents a thriving region. And Ontario's prosperity has been part of the attraction that the GTHA has, not just to Ontario, but also to Canada. And I have had meetings now with respective mayors of London and Guelph and Kitchener, throughout Peel and Mississauga and Brampton, throughout the province, including Ottawa, all of whom have priorities in their respective communities. Again, symptomatic of the fact that Ontario is outpacing the rest of Canada and the G7 countries for that matter. And part of that is, as the mayor has just explained, it's the attraction of the partnership that exists in the GTHA and in Toronto specifically. We also spoke a lot about innovation and fintech and other sectors of the economy that enable us to weather the commodity shocks that are so evident in other parts of Canada. And Toronto has taken a huge leadership in regards to that, be it in biotech, be it in fintech, be it in artificial intelligence, be it even the work that's being done in other parts of the province, be it in Kitchener-Waterloo under quantum research or in Ottawa with regards to autonomous vehicles. All of this is an attraction to our great province. And I acknowledge that the partnership necessary with the Toronto area is crucial in order to enable that ongoing success. It's also important for us to have an understanding of the needs of the communities, especially here, because being a member of the Greater Toronto Area, having worked in Toronto most of my life, having been stuck in the parking lot called the QEW in order to get into the city, having to rely heavily on public transit like the GO systems, I recognize all too well how important it is for us to get this right. And the mayor has done an admirable job, an important job of illustrating those demands, of illustrating the needs of transit priorities in the region and in the city. We talked a lot, as explained, about transit. We talked a lot about Smart Track and the regional express rail. We talked a lot in regards to social housing and housing affordability, but around social housing and enabling us to provide for the operating needs of the community. I just recently signed and agreed to a health accord with the federal government, which included, to some extent, adding a little bit more for social housing and affordable housing so that we can meet those growing demands. In regards to the waterfront development, this is key to the well-being of the region. The community in the waterfront, similar to what's happening in the Mississauga waterfront, are going to enable us to have greater destination for economic development, but that too means having to put infrastructure in place to accommodate that growth. In fact, the growth in the region has been tremendous. It's affecting housing prices as we see. But in order to sustain that growth, we have to have predictable and sustainable funding. And the mayor has made that clear to me, and he's made it clear to the premier. And we understand that. We're trying to make that clear to the federal government in terms of having that fiscal imbalance supported. Because just as Toronto requires support, the rest of the province of Ontario requires it too. And we want to make certain that we do enable to have greater funding supports with our partnership with the federal government as well as the municipalities. We spoke at some respect with regards to sharing an economy, because as we talk about some of the housing initiatives, that also means how do we afford to accommodate the new economy in the region and in the province. And we have established an advisory committee, not only looking at housing prices, but also how do we attain and support the sharing economy as we move forward. So it's been an important discussion. I value the relationship I have with Mayor Tory over many years, even prior to both of us being involved in elected office. But that deliberation, those discussions, that collaboration is essential for our success. The province of Ontario values a strong Toronto, a strong regional area of this area, a strong golden horseshoe. It is an economic power to all of Canada. And we must ensure that those regional transit systems are effective. Just as those relief lines are necessary in the long term here in Toronto, so is the entire corridor.